There are stories that history preferred to forget. Dark ceremonies, cursed books, shadows that never left. Over the next few hours, we will explore the most disturbing mysteries of the Middle Ages. You do not need to see anything. Just listen, and let the past find you. The Curse of the Manuscript of Sins. There are books written to teach, others to preserve knowledge, some to worship, and others to condemn. But there are certain books that simply should not exist. Books that do not seem made for human eyes, whose words feel like the distant echo of something watching us from beyond time. One of those texts, nearly lost among the centuries, is known by a name that medieval monks would whisper under their breath, as if speaking it aloud could summon what they once tried to confine between its pages: the Manuscript of Sins. This book, wrapped in a legend as ancient as it is confusing, appears sporadically in ecclesiastical records from the 14th century. No physical copy has survived, or so it is believed, but indirect mentions, annotated margins in other texts, and the testimonies of tormented scribes allow us to reconstruct a story that chills the blood and challenges even the most skeptical reader. Its original name, if it ever had one, was lost within the walls of some monastery destroyed by fire or forgotten by time. But among the few who have heard of it, it is known as the Liber Culporum, the Book of Guilt, though over time, oral tradition gave it a new title: the Manuscript of Sins. It was not a grimoire, nor an alchemical text, nor a simple religious treatise. It was something else. They said its content did not teach how to do evil, nor did it warn against it. It simply revealed it. Page after page, it listed sins in such detail that it was impossible for the time. It was not about the classic cardinal vices or the transgressions the church had turned into dogma. No. This manuscript described offenses that bordered on the unspeakable. Intimate sins, hidden ones, committed by people who had not yet been born. Stories that, according to the few surviving fragments, were written in a raw, direct, and merciless language. Some scholars suggest that it was a compilation of confessions, possibly gathered over centuries from terrified penitents begging for forgiveness in their final moments of life. But there are details that make this theory insufficient. One of the fragments found in the Abbey of Saint-Benoît-sur-Loire, before a fire destroyed the room where it was kept, contained a meticulous description of a crime committed in a village that did not exist in the century in which the text was supposedly written. The name of the murderer, the number of stab wounds, the exact words spoken by the victim before dying. It was all there, with chilling precision. The monks who attempted to copy the manuscript suffered strange consequences. One of them, Brother Mathieu, left behind a personal diary in which he described how every night, after transcribing a few lines, he began to hear whispering voices behind his cell. At first, he believed they were other brothers playing tricks, until the voices began to repeat exact fragments of the text, even passages he had not yet copied. The diary ends abruptly, with a sentence written in darker, uneven ink, as if by a trembling hand. Now, it is reading me. That monastery was closed months later by order of the Bishop of Orléans, who, according to documents, requested from Rome the immediate closure of a house of prayer corrupted by the language of the damned. The place was sealed, the cells bricked up, and the manuscript supposedly incinerated in secret. However, years later, in the underground library of the University of Heidelberg, a volume bound in worn leather appeared, with no title on its cover. Its content was written in ecclesiastical Latin, but the words appeared incoherent until someone read them aloud. That person was a young theology student named Sebastian Holtz, who recorded his experience in a letter to his teacher. In it, he claimed that upon reciting certain passages from the book, he began to see mental images that did not belong to him. Unknown faces, scenes of violence, intimate secrets that haunted him at night. He thought they were mere delusions until he began to recognize details about people around him. a professor, a woman from town, even one of the librarians. Details that were later confirmed as true, but which he could never have known by normal means. Holtz disappeared shortly after. The last known trace of him was a note found in his room. The book was not written. It allowed itself to be written. I no longer have words that belong only to me. Over the centuries, there are sporadic records of other similar cases. A cursed codex in Krakow that drove an entire congregation insane. A volume confiscated by the Inquisition in Toledo that could only be read at night. And a supposed copy kept by a Slovenian sect who claimed the book contained individual, shifting prophecies adapted to the person reading it. As if the text was not fixed. As if it rewrote its content depending on the reader, bringing to the surface things even the reader did not know they carried inside. The most unsettling thing about the Manuscript of Sins is not what it tells, but how it tells it. It does not accuse, does not preach, does not warn. It simply describes. With a coldness that unsettles, as if whoever wrote it or allowed it to be written had no emotion or moral judgment. There is no condemnation, no redemption, no salvation, only the raw, indifferent account of what we do when no one is watching. Some modern scholars have attempted to trace a pattern, a possible author, a school of thought that explains its existence. Some link it to extreme Gnostic movements, others to lost fragments of the apocryphal Gospels, and some even claim its origin is not human, that it was dictated, not by a demon, but by something older than religions, something that merely observes and records. Whatever its origin, the Manuscript of Sins is one of those objects that seem to exist to prove that there are things the world tries to forget for a reason. Things not meant to be understood, but only to remind us that, beneath the surface of everything we think we understand, there are cracks. Cracks through which truths that should not be named seep out. And although no one knows for sure where it is now, there are those who believe it still exists, that it is still being read, and that somewhere in the world, a new page is about to be written with the next reader. The whispers of the dead in Houska Castle, in the heart of Bohemia, among dense forests that seem to hold their breath and paths that fade into the mist, rises a structure that does not appear to have been conceived to protect its inhabitants from external enemies, but rather to isolate the world from something that was once contained within its walls. This is Houska Castle, a building as disturbing as it is enigmatic, built with an intent that still sends chills down the spines of those who dare to decipher it. Houska was not built to guard borders, nor to resist sieges, not even to house a noble family. Its walls do not face outward. There are no watchtowers or visible strategic defenses. Everything in its design seems to scream a single intention: to close, to seal, to imprison. At the center of the castle stands a chapel, and beneath that chapel, a crack. An opening that, according to the oldest accounts, has no bottom. A fissure that was not discovered, but seemed to have always been there, and that even before the first stone of Houska was laid, was already feared by the region's inhabitants. Medieval chroniclers, although always cautious in addressing such matters, recorded what they heard from the peasants, that from inside the crack came voices, screams, whispers that could not be attributed to man or beast. The accounts spoke of winged, deformed figures that emerged on moonless nights, creatures with human faces and impossible bodies that floated through the forest and left a trail of ice wherever they passed. It was said that crops would die if planted too close to the site, that animals refused to graze nearby, and that even wolves preferred to circle around that land, even if it meant starvation or death. The castle was erected in the 13th century, during the reign of Ottokar II of Bohemia, and according to ecclesiastical documents preserved in the archives of Prague, its construction was financed by the crown, but secretly directed by a religious order whose members never left a record of their names. What is known is that the first step was to seal the crack. To do so, condemned prisoners were sent down with the promise of a pardon if they descended into the hole and described what they saw. None of them lasted more than a few seconds before they began to scream. One of them, a young man accused of murder, was pulled out by force, and when he emerged, his hair had turned white, his skin was gray, and his eyes wandered like those of a disoriented animal. He died 2 days later, muttering words in a language no one could identify. From that moment on, the workers simply sealed the opening with thick slabs of stone and enclosed the place beneath what is now the castle's central chapel. The walls of that room, still accessible to the public, are covered with frescoes that depart completely from conventional sacred art. There are no saints or biblical scenes there. Instead, there are dark, hybrid figures wielding weapons, pointing toward an abyss, painted as a mouth swallowing light. On one of the walls, a faceless angel holds a chain descending into a black fissure. Researchers who have studied the paintings agree that their symbolism is unique in Europe and seems to reflect a cosmology foreign to Christianity, as if the artists had attempted to depict something they had seen but could not fully comprehend. But what has truly fueled Houska's legend through the centuries is not only the myths or the paintings, but what has occurred within its walls long after the castle lost its original function. In the 20th century, during the Nazi occupation, the building was taken over by the SS, who established a research center there, the documentation of which was destroyed before the end of the war. However, accounts from locals and Allied soldiers indicate that the Nazis conducted esoteric experiments in the depths of the castle, especially in the chapel. According to some unofficial reports, choral chants were heard during the early mornings, lights were seen through the sealed windows, and more than once, figures were spotted walking around the building wearing uniforms that did not match any known division. After the war, the castle was abandoned for decades. During that time, many occult researchers, alternative archaeologists, and esoteric groups tried to access its records in lower chambers. Some succeeded in entering, but few published their findings. One of the most well-known was Professor Antonin Lotsky of Charles University in Prague, who documented in his journal an experience that deeply marked him. In one entry, he described spending the night inside the chapel and hearing a choir of female voices singing a lament that, according to him, came from no visible place, but resonated as if the air itself were singing. He also said that, when he tried to record the sound, his devices failed, but upon reviewing the tape, he heard something he had not perceived at the time. A clear voice, in Old Czech, pronouncing his full name, followed by a date which, months later, matched the day of his sudden death. Even today, those who visit the castle claim to feel that something is not right in that place. It is not the typical shiver or the suggestion triggered by ancient sites. It is a heavier sensation, as if the air were charged with something that does not belong to the present. Some guides report that animals refuse to enter certain rooms, and that the security cameras installed over the past decade show inexplicable interference, especially in the chapel area. There are recordings in which shadows are seen moving without people being present, flashes of light emerging from the floor, and even moments when the audio fills with unintelligible whispers. Over time, attempts have been made to rationalize the mystery of Houska with architectural explanations, acoustic conditions, or natural phenomena. It has been claimed that the fissure is simply a deep cave, that the frescoes are a form of symbolic art without deeper meaning, or that the psychological effects result from collective suggestion. However, none of these theories fully explains why a castle was built over a hole that no one wanted to approach, why resources were invested in sealing something rather than taking advantage of the location for defense, nor why so many witnesses, over centuries, describe such similar things without ever having met. Houska Castle is not in ruins. It still stands, as if waiting. Its walls, covered with moss and years, seem to hold a silence that is only broken when someone dares to spend the night inside. Some claim that, beneath the chapel, the stone trembles on certain early mornings, that if you get close enough to the ground, you can hear what no one should hear. Ancient voices, trapped beneath centuries of stone, repeating sins that were never forgiven. Voices that do not ask for help. They only repeat, again and again, as if someone or something remained down there, waiting for you to open the crack once more. The Missing Pope. John XV, the pontiff who never existed. There are mistakes that can be corrected with an apology, others that are forgotten with the passage of time, and a few that are buried under mountains of silence. But there is a more peculiar kind of mistake, more unsettling, more persistent, the kind that no one admits, yet continues to exist, like a crack in a wall too ancient to tear down. That is the case of the mysterious Pope John V, a name that appears in the official numbering of popes, yet whose existence has never been confirmed. A pope who never ruled, who was never elected, and yet holds a place in history, a place someone, at some point, made sure to keep empty. For centuries, the throne of Peter has been occupied by men who bore the weight of the sacred and the political in varying proportions, often surrounded by scandals, conspiracies, wars, heresies, and miracles. The history of the popes is filled with both light and shadow, and precisely because of this, it has been documented with a level of detail bordering on obsession. Every election, every conclave, every papal bull is recorded in the Vatican archives with almost mystical zeal. But between John XIX and John XXI, there is an unexplainable jump. An omission no one has ever fully corrected. There is no Pope John V, and yet John XXI chose his name assuming that someone before him had already used 20. A simple numerical confusion, some might say, a miscalculation in the order of the popes. But when one digs a little deeper, searching the margins of the documents, the silences in the records, the contradictions in the chronicles, the mystery thickens. Most modern historians attribute the case to an error committed in the 13th century when Pedro Julián, the man who would become known as John XXI, assumed the papacy. According to this version, Pedro, a scholar and physician by training, consulted an incorrect list of pontiffs in which the number 20 had already been assigned to another John, though such a pope never existed. Thus, believing he had to continue the numbering, he adopted the number 21, leaving a permanent gap in the official line of popes. It seems like a reasonable explanation. Innocent even. But there are too many pieces that do not quite fit. First, because at that time the Vatican was not an administrative mess. On the contrary, ecclesiastical bureaucracy was strict, meticulous, and deeply hierarchical. A numbering error of that sort would not only have been detected but immediately corrected, especially considering the symbolism of the papal name. Second, because in certain documents from the previous century, specifically in a codex preserved in the Vatican Apostolic Library and dated to the 12th century, the figure of a Ioannis Duodecimus Decimus, that is, John the 20th, is mentioned briefly. The entry is crossed out, without any explanation, as if someone had wanted to erase not a line, but an entire figure from history. That isolated mention would not carry much weight if it were not for the fact that in later centuries, other clues appear. A letter from the Bishop of Cluny to the King of France, dated around the year 1186, mentions the brief but disconcerting administration of Pope Ioannis, recently deceased and already mired in controversy. However, there are no official records of any pope with that name during that same period. It is as if there had been a pope for such a short, tumultuous, or inappropriate time that his memory was systematically erased from the Church's annals. And even stranger, some later ecclesiastical documents refer to a minor council held in secret, where it was decided to annul certain pontifical decisions attributed to an unconsecrated usurper. The name of the usurper is never specified, nor his exact role. But the timelines match. A more daring line of investigation suggests that John Juan did exist, although not as a legitimate pope, but as an anti-pope. In other words, someone who took the papal throne during a time of crisis or division, possibly supported by a specific faction of the clergy or nobility. At times when the papacy was as much spiritual as political, such conflicts were more common than many believe. And although history has recorded several anti-popes by name and date, some insist that John de Piet was different, not because of what he did, but because of what he supposedly knew. A marginal but fascinating hypothesis suggests that this mysterious pontiff, during his brief time in power, gained access to forbidden documents, sealed relics, or knowledge kept hidden even from most cardinals. It is said that he promoted an esoteric interpretation of certain gospels, that he questioned established dogmas, and that he even ordered a complete revision of the biblical canon, proposing the inclusion of apocryphal texts that would radically alter the image of Jesus, of Mary, and of salvation itself. A threat far too dangerous to tolerate. According to this version, he was not deposed. He was eliminated. Not publicly, not through trial, not by excommunication. He was erased. His existence was denied so effectively that even his name became an anomaly. But like any shadow, he left traces, echoes, gaps no rational explanation has been able to fill. Because if it were truly just a simple numbering error, there should not be so many contradictory documents, nor so many efforts to silence specific mentions. There should not be crossed-out texts, deleted names, or official versions that change over time. The figure of John the Baptist is like a hole in a painting. You do not see the character, but his absence is so evident it suggests he was once there, and that someone deliberately removed him. The Vatican itself has never issued a conclusive official explanation. The line of succession simply skips from Pope John XIX to 21, as if nothing had happened, as if no shadow existed between them, as if no one had ruled for a few months, or a few weeks, or perhaps just a single day. This case becomes even more unsettling when compared to other similar episodes in ecclesiastical history, like the famous Pope Joan, whose existence continues to be debated with equal fervor, or the sealed documents that have never been declassified and supposedly contain records of secret councils, unacknowledged apparitions, and decisions that change the course of Christianity without the faithful ever knowing. In that context, the disappearance of a pope is not as implausible as it seems. If anything, it is far too plausible. The fascinating thing about the mystery of John de Piet is not just that he is missing from the lists, it is that his absence has been constructed with too much precision, as if someone had not simply omitted him, but had worked to create a convincing void. And yet, every so often, in some forgotten library, in a marginal note written by a trembling hand, in a codex damaged by humidity and the centuries, his name appears, only for an instant. And then, it vanishes again. Because perhaps it is not that John de Piet never existed. Perhaps he did exist. Perhaps he was elected. Perhaps he tried to change something he should not have. And for that, he was not condemned. He was erased, as if the most dangerous thing was not his power, but his memory. As if the truth he knew was so disturbing that the punishment was not death, but oblivion. And that, for a pope, is the most absolute condemnation imaginable. The Black Cat Ritual at Montségur. In the south of France, among the rugged peaks of the Pyrenees, stands a solitary, proud fortress that watches over the landscape as if still awaiting the return of those who once defended it with more faith than fear. Montségur, Cathar stronghold, has for centuries been a symbol of spiritual resistance, of heresy, and of tragedy. Its walls, worn down by wind and time, still seem to guard secrets that neither fire nor steel managed to destroy. There, among the ruins and the echoes of a persecuted past, a dark legend blossoms. A story nearly silenced by the church and preserved only in the whispers of local villagers. The ritual of the Black Cat. To understand what this strange episode entails, one must first understand who the Cathars were. These men and women, branded heretics by the papacy, proposed a vision of Christianity profoundly different from the official one. They believed in the existence of two gods, one of good and one of evil. They held that the material world was the creation of the evil one, and that the soul must be freed from this prison of flesh to reunite with the true divinity. They rejected the authority of the Church of Rome, wealth, traditional sacraments, and lived in humble communities guided by the so-called perfects, spiritual leaders who renounced all worldly pleasures. This doctrine, which directly challenged the foundations of ecclesiastical power, was met with fierce brutality. In the year 1244, after months of siege, Montségur fell under the weight of the crusading troops sent by the Pope. Over 200 Cathars were burned alive at the foot of the castle, in what is known as the largest bonfire of the Inquisition. However, there are records, mere fragments from contemporary witnesses, that claim the Cathars performed a singular ritual in the days before the massacre. Not a Christian ceremony, nor a desperate prayer, but something stranger. A rite in which the central figure was a black cat. The first puzzling aspect of this story is the source. It does not come from enemies of the Cathars, nor from inquisitors eager to justify their extermination. It comes from a letter written by a Franciscan friar who accompanied the crusading troops. In it, the friar mentions that, from a distance, he observed a scene he could not interpret. A kind of nocturnal ceremony held at the top of the castle, where the Cathars formed a circle around a feline figure with dark fur. He wrote that some spoke to the creature, as if it responded with gestures everyone seemed to understand. He also mentioned a chant in an unknown language, which was neither Latin nor Occitan, nor any tongue he could recognize. This testimony was dismissed for centuries as an exaggeration, an attempt to demonize the Cathars. But in the 19th century, a local historian named Émile Saunière, uncle of the famed priest of Rennes-le-Château, found a much more compromising document among the archives of the bishopric of Carcassonne. The partial transcript of an inquisitorial interrogation, dated a few years after the fall of Montségur, where a prisoner confessed to having taken part in the feline rite, an ancestral ceremony that, according to his words, did not belong to the Cathars, but predated their faith. The detainee claimed that the Cathar perfects knew of an ancient tradition, inherited from pagan times, and that in moments of greatest despair, they turned to it as a last resort. In this ceremony, the black cat was not a symbol of evil, nor a demonic figure, as the church would later insist. It was a mediator, a being sensitive to the invisible, capable of crossing the veil between this world and the next. During the ritual, it was spoken to in whispers, offered milk, bread, and blood, and then, once silence prevailed, the animal walked among the participants and chose one. That person had to withdraw alone with the cat, and afterward, no one ever saw them again. The transcript does not clarify whether this involved sacrifice, transformation, or some form of spiritual surrender. What is clear is that those who organized this rite believed the cat could carry a soul to the other side, not to the Christian heaven, but to a more ancient plane, closer to the essence of the universe. A place without dogma, without punishment, without hierarchies. Only light, darkness, and silence. This vision may be difficult to accept today, and the modern imagination has completely distorted the image of the black cat, associating it with witchcraft, curses, or bad luck. But in many ancient cultures, from Egypt to the Caucasus, the black cat was a symbol of spiritual power, of protection, even of nobility. What is strange is not that the Cathars used it in a ritual, but that they did so in plain view, knowing they were surrounded, that death was imminent, that there was no escape. Some scholars believe that the ceremony was not an invocation but a farewell. that the Cathars knew they would be exterminated and tried to send a message, a signal, or perhaps a soul beyond this world. Others maintain it was not a symbolic rite, but a concrete action with invisible results. According to certain Occitan legends, shortly after the Montségur pyre, black cats began to appear in great numbers around the castle. Silent, elusive, watchful. Shepherds said that at night they would gather atop the hill, as if awaiting instructions. Some claim to have seen them even today, among the ruined stones, moving in groups, always in odd numbers. This narrative, which might seem like a folkloric delusion, takes on an unsettling weight when cross-referenced with Inquisition documents. Because in later years, during trials against other heresies, such as the witches of northern Italy or Germanic sects, a recurring accusation appears: having worshipped the black cat. The question becomes inevitable. How did that image reach such distant regions? Was it transmitted by Cathar survivors hidden in the margins of Europe? Or was it the trace of a belief much deeper, older than any organized religion? Montségur still stands, wounded, but standing. Every year, hundreds of people climb its ruins in search of answers, or perhaps just of silence. Some claim to feel a presence, a vibration in the air, a shift in the atmosphere as the sun sets. They say the cats still come, that they reveal themselves only when the visitor is alone, without intent, without questions. Others laugh and prefer to talk about history, medieval politics, power struggles. But even they lower their voices at the summit, as if something in the place reminded them that, among the broken stones and forgotten legends, an ancient echo may still resonate. The echo of a ritual that did not seek to save bodies, but souls. The echo of the black cat walking among the shadows. The boy from Nuremberg. In the 19th century, in a Europe that was beginning to open its doors to rationalism, to science, and to Enlightenment thinking, a figure appeared who seemed to have escaped from the darkest corners of the Middle Ages. He was a young boy. His clothes were tattered, his movements were clumsy, and his eyes reflected the confusion of someone seeing the world for the first time. He could not speak clearly, could barely walk, and when he finally managed to pronounce a few words, he repeated the same thing over and over, as if his mind held only a single memory. I want to be a horseman, like my father. That day in May of 1828, in the city of Nuremberg, not only did a disoriented boy appear in a public square, but one of the most unsettling and difficult to explain cases in modern history began. His name was recorded as Kaspar Hauser. His origin, however, could never be established with certainty. And his life, from the moment he was found until his death, was a puzzle of contradictions, theories, secrets, and silences that still today generates controversy among historians, psychologists, and scholars of the mysterious. According to the testimony of those who found him, Kaspar appeared to be between 16 and 17 years old, although he behaved like a small child. He had trouble standing upright for long periods, did not know how to use basic utensils, and was unfamiliar with concepts as elementary as money, food, or the warmth of the sun. When they tried to speak to him, he only showed a letter he carried with him, supposedly written by an anonymous guardian who had raised him under conditions of extreme isolation. In that letter, it was explained that the boy had never left a locked room, and that his caretaker had never allowed him to see daylight. The letter added that the young man wished to be admitted into the service of the excellent 6th Cavalry Regiment, like his late father. This, more than a request, sounded like a delusion built from an incomprehensible fantasy. The citizens of Nuremberg were fascinated. The boy became an attraction, a symbol of innocence and mystery. He was taken in by the city, examined by doctors, studied by educators, questioned by authorities, and soon became the center of a controversy that grew more complex with each passing day. Because as Caspar learned to speak and navigate the outside world, he began to recount a disturbing story. He said he had lived his entire life locked in a windowless cell, without human company, without any kind of stimulation. At first, his only contact was a blurry figure that left him bread and water, and over time, a hand, always hidden behind a mask or in the shadows, that taught him a few words and forced him to repeat phrases without context. The most chilling part of his story was not the physical confinement, but the way he described his perception of the world. Caspar claimed that for years he did not understand that there was an outside. To him, all that was real was limited to that timeless space, without history, without horizons. He said he did not know his own face until he saw his reflection for the first time, already free. That the taste of bread in the square was different from the one he was given in his prison. That the sun was so intense he thought he would die just by looking at it. Details that, more than touching, revealed a condition of radical isolation, impossible to grasp from our usual experience. Meanwhile, rumors began to spread. Some said Caspar was a fraud, that it had all been an elaborate invention, a social experiment or a political maneuver. Others claimed he was the descendant of a royal house, perhaps the legitimate heir of the House of Baden, hidden for reasons of state and replaced by another child who mysteriously died. This theory, though fanciful, was supported by influential figures of the time, including Count Stanhope, who adopted the boy for a while and even invested large sums of money in an effort to prove his supposed noble lineage. But the truth kept slipping away, as if Caspar had been torn from a parallel world, too similar to ours to be a fiction, but too strange to be explained by logic. His story became even more confusing when the attacks began. On at least 3 occasions, Caspar was assaulted by strangers. In one, he was given a deep cut on the forehead while he slept. In another, a hooded figure tried to strangle him in the garden where he used to walk. The attackers were never identified, and the police were surprisingly slow in their investigations. Caspar survived, though each incident seemed to leave him more fragile, more frightened, more distrustful. His environment began to fall apart. Those who once defended him began to doubt. Doctors diagnosed him with mental disorders. Educators started to see him as a hopeless case, and the politicians who had used him as a symbol quietly walked away. On December 14, 1833, Caspar appeared gravely wounded in the abdomen. According to his own account, he had been summoned by a stranger who handed him a bag containing a letter. At the moment he tried to open it, he was stabbed. The wound was not superficial, and the young man died 3 days later, in a state of delirium, fever, and disturbing silence. The letter he carried, written in strange handwriting, contained disjointed phrases, misspelled names, and incoherent references to places that did not exist. Some cryptography experts have tried to decipher it, without success. The only thing clear is that it was written with the intention of confusing, diverting attention, or confirming a message that no one has ever fully understood. After his death, his grave was visited for years by the curious, believers, conspiracy theorists, and simple travelers. On the headstone, a phrase carved in simple Gothic style sums up the mystery. Here lies Caspar Hauser, enigma of his time, born and died in darkness. Modern DNA analyses, conducted in the 21st century from hair and personal items, failed to establish a conclusive link with the House of Baden, but neither could they completely rule out the possibility. His origin remains an unanswered question, an echo that repeats through history like a poorly copied fragment of an incomplete score. Caspar Hauser remains an uncomfortable symbol, a reminder that even in the height of modernity, in a literate Europe with universities, courts, and science, a figure can emerge who does not fit into any category, who cannot be explained by psychology, nor history, nor politics. Someone who appears without context, without past, without references, like a character who escaped from the margin of a forgotten book. Perhaps the most disturbing part of his story is not what he lived, but the certainty that, despite all efforts, we still do not understand who he was, where he came from, or why someone went to such great lengths to keep him away from the world. The Devil's Codes in the Monastery of Lucedio. In the heart of the Italian Piedmont, among rice fields and rarely traveled roads, stand the ruins of an ancient monastery, whose mere mention still sends a shiver down the spine of those who know its history. The Monastery of Lucedio is not just any place. Founded in the 12th century by Cistercian monks, it should have been a bastion of spirituality, prayer, and contemplation. However, what actually happened within its walls has been, for centuries, a source of suspicion, silence, and a lingering unease in the air that surrounds its gray stones. Because Lucedio was not remembered for its faith, but for whispers of heretical practices, dark rituals, and codes that many believe were dictated by a voice that was not human. What makes this monastery so particular is not a single story, but a dense web of tales, symbols, documents, and testimonies that, when viewed separately, may appear to be unrelated fragments, but that together form a disturbing pattern. A pattern that suggests that something within Lucedio deeply strayed from its original purpose. That what began as a house of God ended up becoming a sanctuary for something completely opposite. The architecture of the monastery, even in its current state, retains elements that do not align with traditional Cistercian standards. The layout of the church, for instance, is oriented in the opposite direction from what is customary, as if the monks had preferred to face the shadow rather than the light. Beneath the main altar, instead of sacred relics, a circular crypt was discovered, covered with inscriptions in distorted Latin, accompanied by symbols whose origin has not been clearly determined. There, according to historians who have been able to study the site, were found the remains of several monks buried in a vertical position, their heads wrapped in cloth and black wax seals placed over their mouths, as if their silence, even in death, had been considered essential. The first document that openly speaks of a deviation at Lucedio dates back to the late 13th century. In it, an ecclesiastical inspector sent from Rome notes with evident concern that the monks of the place practice incomprehensible rites, express themselves in a language that seems like Latin but is not, and maintain prolonged fasts that end in trances or states of exaltation, in which they claim to receive messages they cannot share with the living. The inspector never returned to the Vatican. His body was found days later in a nearby ditch, his eyes open and a petrified expression of terror on his face. The report he wrote disappeared from the papal archives for centuries until a copy, incomplete, was found in the library of Turin. For generations, the inhabitants of nearby villages avoided passing by the monastery, especially at night. Some claimed to have seen lights moving inside the abbey long after it had been abandoned. Others spoke of deep chants, of bells ringing without being touched, and of hooded figures walking among the shadows when no monks were left alive. A 17th century priest, who attempted to reopen the church, wrote in his diary that the stained glass windows of the building seemed to change slightly each day, as if the images within them were slowly transforming. He claimed to have seen an angel depicted on one of the rose windows that, days later, had horns. No one else was able to verify his testimony. The priest disappeared one morning, and his writings were confiscated by the Inquisition. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the monastery of Lucedio is not its rites, nor its vertical tombs, nor its muted chants. What has caused the most controversy among modern scholars is a set of encrypted manuscripts found in a hidden compartment of the sacristy in the year 1985. The documents, written on parchment, were composed in a mixture of ecclesiastical Latin, archaic Hebrew, and unknown symbols. Their structure followed complex mathematical patterns, with numerical sequences that resembled alchemical formulas. After years of study, some fragments were partially translated, revealing contextless phrases that suggested a direct relationship with entities or intelligences that were not human. One of the deciphered passages mentions something the monks referred to as the voice of the rift, a kind of invisible entity that manifested only during certain lunar cycles and that transmitted forbidden knowledge to those who knew how to listen. There is mention of shared visions, of symbols engraved on the skin during sleep, and of a code dictated through choral singing, in which musical notes replaced words. According to the few experts who have dared to study these texts in depth, some of the formulas contained within them seem to reproduce patterns of auditory frequencies that, when played, generate an anomalous cerebral response, very similar to deep trance or depersonalization experiences. At this point, the story of Lucedio moves away from the realm of legend to enter something more serious, more dangerous, more difficult to refute with simple arguments. Because if those encrypted codes were indeed created by monks, then we are facing a knowledge that escapes the framework of its time, both for its mathematical complexity and for its symbolic implications. And if, as some theorists have suggested, the texts were dictated by an external source, then we should ask ourselves who, or what, was communicating with those reclusive religious men, and for what purpose. There are those who claim that it was all a heretical deviation of the Cistercian order, an isolated cell that, abandoned by ecclesiastical authority, gave itself over to the most dangerous mystical experimentation. Others believed that the monks of Lucedio were actually custodians of a knowledge older than Christianity, and that their monastery was built precisely there because the place was an energetic convergence point, a natural vortex that allowed access to alternate realities. Whatever the truth may be, the fact is that the Vatican ordered the definitive closure of the monastery in the mid-18th century, and the documents related to the abbey were classified. Some disappeared, others, as has happened so many times, were denied. And yet, the echo of Lucedio remains alive. Today, the ruins of the monastery can be visited, although certain sections remain sealed to the public. Some explorers claim to have found new inscriptions beneath layers of mold, symbols that seem to glow faintly under specific lighting conditions, as if they were made of something not belonging to this world. Inexplicable sounds have been recorded, electronic interferences, and there are testimonies from people who, after visiting the place, have experienced recurring dreams with phrases in languages they never learned. Lucedio is not just another ruin among many. It is a warning, a reminder that even in places where spiritual peace was meant to reign, rifts can open into the unknown, rifts that are not always closed with prayers, and even less so with silence. The Witch of Torsåker, the bloodiest trial in Europe. In the cold and peaceful landscapes of northern Sweden, among gentle hills and forests that seem to keep secrets in their treetops, lies one of the most disturbing and least known stories of the witch hunts in Europe. When people speak of this dark chapter in history, most think of Salem in Puritan New England, or the Bamberg and Würzburg trials in 17th century war-torn Germany. However, it was in a small Swedish village named Torsåker where the bloodiest trial ever recorded in relation to witchcraft took place. A terrifying episode, nearly buried by time, in which more than 70 people were beheaded in a single day, after confessions extracted under dubious conditions, and driven by a fanaticism that blended religion, superstition, and an atmosphere of collective paranoia that even today is difficult to comprehend logically. The tragedy began in 1668 in a context where Sweden was experiencing deep social, religious, and economic tensions. The 30 Years' War had left deep scars, and the spiritual climate of the country, dominated by Lutheranism, was beginning to be shaped by a church increasingly eager to consolidate its power and eliminate any form of deviation. It was in that context that a local priest, named Laurentius Christophori Horneus, began to receive accusations from children who claimed to have been taken by local women to the witches' Sabbath, a supposed nocturnal gathering with the devil himself, held in secret places where pacts were sealed, sacred symbols were desecrated, and evil formulas were learned. What might have initially seemed like a childish tale, or a fantasy fed by rural folklore, soon acquired unexpected gravity. Horneus, convinced that the souls of the children were in danger, began a personal crusade to identify and punish those responsible. He gathered testimonies, compiled lists, and under his leadership, a parallel ecclesiastical tribunal was organized that began to interrogate women, and some men, who had lived in the region for years without causing any major disturbance. The key to these interrogations was always the same. The children, many of them cousins or neighbors, claimed they had been flown through the night by familiar figures who took them to a cursed farm where blasphemous rituals were performed, all under the supervision of the devil, described as a man with glowing eyes and a shifting face. The hysteria spread with a speed reminiscent of the most virulent epidemics. It was enough for a child to say a name for that person to be brought before the court. Confessions were obtained without physical evidence, based on accounts of dreams, visions, or vague statements extracted under pressure. The accused, mostly elderly women, midwives, healers, or simply loners, at first denied everything firmly. But after days without sleep, veiled threats, and constant psychological manipulation, many ended up admitting the charges just to stop the suffering. Others, according to some records, simply broke down upon seeing that their own children had been led to accuse them publicly. What sets the Torsåker case apart from other contemporary trials is not only the number of victims, but the systematic nature of their execution. In June of 1675, 71 people, 65 women and 6 men, were sentenced to death for witchcraft. The method was particularly cruel. Instead of burning at the stake, decapitation was chosen. Faster, more efficient, almost industrial. And the most sinister detail was that after being beheaded, their bodies were burned in a common pyre, as if they were a plague to be completely eradicated without leaving a trace. The official records of the trial are partial, contradictory, and in many cases deliberately ambiguous. There are inexplicable gaps in the files, names crossed out, margin notes seemingly written by different hands, and fragments referring to earlier events that were never documented. Some theories suggest that what happened in Torsåker was much more than a case of mass hysteria, that there was an economic or political motivation behind the extermination. Many of the victims owned valuable land, well-located properties, or maintained a degree of autonomy in an environment increasingly controlled by ecclesiastical authority. The suspicion that the trial was a pretext to confiscate assets or silence dissenting voices has never been fully confirmed, but neither has it been dismissed by serious historians who have investigated the case. The most unsettling detail is that among the eyewitnesses, there was at least one figure whose identity has never been clearly determined. It was a woman described in the records as the one who did not speak, present during the executions, dressed in black, writing in a book that disappeared after the massacre. Some chroniclers suggest she was an official sent from Stockholm to ensure the legality of the process. Others believe she was a kind of observer, a figure outside the judicial system, whose true purpose was never revealed. Her presence, mentioned in at least 3 testimonies, has given rise to all kinds of speculation. Some claim the Torsåker trial was not merely a witch hunt, but a social experiment, a test to measure the limits of obedience, fear, and collective manipulation. To this day, at the site where the execution took place, stands a silent field, covered with tall grass and wildflowers. There are no grand monuments or official plaques, only a modest stone with an inscription that soberly recalls what happened. However, those who live nearby say that on the coldest nights, when the wind whistles through the trees, cries can be heard that do not come from any animal. Some claim to have seen silhouettes in the mist. Others say that clocks stop when crossing the path that leads to the field. There is no evidence, of course, but the truth is that few dare to walk through that place after sunset. The Torsåker trial is not among the most well-known events in European history. It rarely appears in school textbooks, and yet it marks a before and after in the history of spiritual repression. It is a painful reminder of how far the combination of fear, ignorance, and absolute power can go. But it also holds a mystery that remains unresolved. What exactly happened in that Swedish village? Was it truly uncontrolled hysteria? Or was there something more? Something that has been deliberately hidden under layers of historical reinterpretation? Some unpublished documents, recently found in church archives, speak of a black book of confessions, supposedly written by Horneus himself, in which rituals were recorded that never came to light. Words in unknown languages are mentioned, descriptions of marks engraved on the skin of the accused, and references to a circle within the forest, where it was said the earth would not accept crops. These documents are still being studied, and perhaps they will never be published in full. But they suggest that what happened in Torsåker was not as simple as a series of witchcraft trials. It was something deeper, darker, and much more disturbing. The dancing plague of Strasbourg. There are moments in history when logic seems to take a pause, as if the invisible rules that govern human behavior suddenly give way to an inexplicable force, a crack that opens without warning, and through which the world slips into the absurd, the incomprehensible, and the disturbing. One such moment occurred in the summer of 1518 in the city of Strasbourg, when dozens, then hundreds of people began dancing in the streets without rest, as if possessed by an invisible urgency, an unstoppable compulsion that drove them to collapse, to fever, and in many cases to death. This was not a celebration, nor a local festivity, nor an impromptu artistic act. It was an epidemic, a dance without music, without joy, without meaning, that spread as if it were a contagious disease, even though doctors did not know how to explain it, let alone how to stop it. It all began with a single woman. Her name was Frau Trophea. She left her house one morning in July and, without saying a word, began moving through the streets with erratic steps, arms raised, bare feet striking the ground insistently. At first, neighbors watched her with curiosity, then with concern. But hours passed, and the woman did not stop. She danced until she collapsed from exhaustion, slept briefly, and started moving again as if something inside her was pushing her. What happened next seems pulled from a fable without a moral. Within days, other people began to join her. First a few, then dozens. They all moved in similar ways, with repetitive gestures, vacant stares, sweaty, panting, paying no attention to the pleas of their relatives or the threats of the guards. They danced during the day and during the night, under the relentless sun and the pale moon, as if their bodies no longer belonged to them, as if an invisible will dragged them along. And when they fell, with torn muscles or feet raw to the bone, they barely rested before getting back up again. Some cried as they danced. Others laughed. Some sang incomprehensible phrases, as if receiving instructions from a place that could not be seen. The authorities in Strasbourg, baffled by the situation, turned to the doctors, who ruled out a supernatural cause. They attributed the phenomenon to an excess of hot blood in the body, a popular humoral theory at the time. And instead of stopping the dancers, they ordered space to be provided for them to continue. A stage was prepared in the central market. Musicians were hired to accompany them, and halls were opened where they could move without harming others. But this decision only worsened the situation. The music, instead of calming the bodies, seemed to intensify the compulsion, as if every drum, every lute, every flute fed an energy that could no longer be contained. The phenomenon reached its most extreme point when deaths began to be recorded, due to exhaustion, heart attacks, nervous breakdowns. The numbers vary, but some chronicles speak of more than 15 deaths per day during the most intense weeks. And although the authorities ordered masses, processions, and acts of penance, the epidemic did not subside. It was as if the entire city had been seized by an intangible presence, a spell that could not be broken by prayers or punishments, a secret language only the bodies could understand. As the days passed, explanations began to multiply. Some believed it to be demonic possession. Others spoke of a curse related to Saint Vitus, a martyr who was believed to provoke convulsive dances in those who defied him or ignored his feast day. The church organized processions to his sanctuary, and the afflicted were taken there on stretchers, in the hope that the saint's relics could stop the crisis. It was then that slowly, the tide began to recede. One by one, the bodies stopped moving. The city returned to calm, but was left marked by an invisible scar. The most unsettling part of this episode is that it was not unique. In other regions of the Holy Roman Empire, such as Aachen and Basel, similar episodes were recorded, though less massive. People who began dancing for no reason, who could not stop, who spoke in incomprehensible tongues and seemed to act under invisible orders. Over the centuries, many attempts have been made to explain what happened in Strasbourg from different perspectives. Some historians have attributed it to ergot, a hallucinogenic fungus that contaminates grains and can induce visions, convulsions, and erratic behavior. This theory, while intriguing, has inconsistencies. If the cause had been dietary, it would have affected more people, including the elderly, children, and animals. Moreover, the physical symptoms described do not fully match those of ergot poisoning. Other researchers prefer to see the epidemic as an extreme case of mass hysteria, a psychosocial response to the extreme tensions of the time. Strasbourg, in those years, was suffering from a series of ongoing calamities: famine, disease, religious conflict, moral repression. The people lived under unbearable pressure, and in that context, dancing may have acted as a release valve, a collective catharsis disguised as a curse, where the body became the channel through which repressed suffering was expressed. But even this theory, which enjoys some academic support, does not fully explain the depth of the phenomenon. Because if it was a form of hysteria, how could it last for weeks? How is it that so many people shared the same symptoms, the same hallucinations, the same rhythmic movements, as if they were following an invisible score? There are also bolder theories, almost heretical for conventional historical thinking. Some authors have suggested the possibility of a primitive social control experiment, an attempt to manipulate human behavior through sounds, rhythms, or hypnotic suggestions. Others believe the phenomenon was, in essence, a form of collective trance, a spontaneous connection to something beyond the human, something that manifests in moments of breakdown, when reason is no longer enough and the body takes control. Whatever the truth may be, what happened in Strasbourg remains a mystery, a strange parenthesis in history where logic had no place. To this day, in the modern city, little physical trace of the event remains. The streets have changed, the buildings have been rebuilt, and the records have been scattered or absorbed into academic libraries. But some say that, on certain hot summer nights, when the silence becomes thick and the squares are empty, a vibration can be felt in the air, a faint rhythm, almost imperceptible, like a distant echo of those days when bodies danced until they died. Some street musicians, unaware of the story, claim that there are corners where their melodies become incoherent, as if something were interfering with the rhythm. And there are those who, without any apparent explanation, begin to move for just a few seconds, as if something ancient were calling them from beneath the ground. What happened in Strasbourg was not a legend, nor an invention. It is recorded. It was real. Hundreds of people dancing without reason, driven by a force no one understood. And although time has passed, the mystery remains, silent, waiting. The cursed Bestiary of Aberdeen. Throughout the Middle Ages, the world was, for many, a vast expanse of the unknown. Maps were filled with blank areas labeled with warnings. Oceans teemed with mythological creatures, and nature was a constant mystery that fluctuated between the divine and the monstrous. It was in this context of symbolic and spiritual darkness that bestiaries were born. Illustrated books that brought together real and fantastical animals in a single volume, explaining their habits, morphology, and above all, their moral meaning. Among all the bestiaries that have survived, one stands out not only for its beauty, but for a story that has endured through the centuries like a disturbing whisper, a warning disguised as an illustrated catalogue. This is the Bestiary of Aberdeen. This manuscript, dated to the 12th century, is currently kept at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland, where it has been studied, analyzed, and digitized, but never completely understood. It is a work of illuminated art, with over 100 illustrations accompanied by Latin texts describing the creatures and explaining their possible spiritual meanings. So far, nothing out of the ordinary. What makes this manuscript disturbing is not its explicit content, but the strange coincidences, anomalies, and implications that arise when it is observed closely. To begin with, many of the creatures shown in its pages simply do not exist in the known world, not even within the usual repertoire of medieval mythology. There are animals with segmented bodies reminiscent of modern parasites, yet with biological details impossible for that time. There are serpent-like beings that appear to precisely describe abyssal creatures not discovered by science until the late 20th century. There is even a figure resembling a giant bat, with wings covered in dermal folds, that looks much like what we would now identify as a pterosaur. That is, an extinct animal whose existence could not have been imagined by a 12th century monk with no access to fossils or paleontological knowledge. Some have tried to attribute these illustrations to pure imagination, religious symbolism, or oral traditions distorted by generations of copyists. However, others have dared to suggest that the author or authors of the Bestiary of Aberdeen had access to a different source of information, one that did not come from the observable natural world or classical texts, a source that perhaps should not have been opened. Because beyond the animals described, there is something else in the manuscript. Patterns, sequences, visual structures that seem to be there for a hidden reason. One of the most intriguing cases is that of the illustration of the basilisk, a creature half rooster and half serpent, with a gaze capable of killing. In the Bestiary of Aberdeen, this figure is accompanied by a series of wavy lines, seemingly decorative, that surround the animal's body like a kind of energetic halo. For a long time, these were believed to be meaningless ornaments, until a 19th century researcher discovered that by joining the ends of these lines and superimposing them in a geometric pattern, they formed a spiral identical to the Fibonacci sequence. This mathematical coincidence, too specific to be accidental, led to a new wave of interpretations. Some scholars began to wonder whether the bestiary was merely a catalogue, or if, on the contrary, it concealed a code, a hidden structure within the structure, a truth disguised as fable. Over time, new theories emerged, that each illustration was linked to specific constellations, that the positions of the animal's eyes corresponded to celestial coordinates, that the colors used in certain images followed a chromatic sequence impossible to achieve with the pigments of the time. Everything seemed too intentional, as if the book had been designed not to be read but deciphered. To this were added testimonies, many of them ancient, that indicated a cursed pattern surrounding the manuscript. There are records of several copyists and translators who died under strange circumstances after working with the text. One of them, a Benedictine monk from the 14th century, wrote in his diary that while translating the chapter dedicated to the lion that never sleeps, he began to hear noises in his cell at night. Dull thuds, breaths that did not come from his body, the scraping of claws on stone. He claimed that every time he opened the manuscript, something in the atmosphere grew heavier. His last entry, A solitary phrase in the margin of folio 41 read, "He already knows I am watching him." Later in the 18th century, a Scottish collector acquired the Bestiary for his private library. His name was Archibald Wren, and he was known for his fascination with the occult. He died suddenly in his study, surrounded by his books. The police found the body next to the open manuscript and a candle that had gone out without consuming any wax. Most unsettling was that the page on which the book lay open, the one depicting a kind of black bird with dense plumage, had been scribbled over in fresh ink, even though there were no inkwells or pens near the body. A concrete cause of death was never established. Today, the Bestiary of Aberdeen remains under strict conservation, and its digital version is consulted by thousands of people around the world. However, even in virtual format, some users have reported strange experiences. Images that change position when the page is refreshed. Illustrations that seem to move subtly when observed for too long. Details that disappear or appear depending on the day or the device used to access the site. The archive staff deny any anomalies. They attribute everything to display errors or overactive imaginations. But the comments continue to accumulate. The mystery of the Bestiary of Aberdeen is not just that of an old book with strange drawings. It is that of an object that seems to possess a will of its own. A manuscript that refuses to be classified as a simple medieval curiosity. Some believe it was written under divine or diabolical inspiration. Others, bolder still, claim it is the legacy of a vanished civilization. A form of knowledge that survived in secret and only reveals itself to those prepared to understand it, or doomed by trying. Whatever the truth may be, the Bestiary of Aberdeen is still there, intact, watching from its pages with eyes of ink, waiting for someone to look too long or read too deeply, and perhaps, at some point, to reveal that which no one should ever know. The Heresy of the Flagellants of Würzburg. In the densest and darkest margins of medieval spirituality, there were movements that escaped the control of the Church, driven by a faith that no longer needed altars or priests, only skin, blood, and penance. They were men and women who believed that physical pain could open the doors to the divine, that the body had to be punished so the soul could find redemption. They lived in perpetual procession, walking barefoot through cities and fields, beating their own flesh until it bled, chanting deep songs that spoke of the end, judgment, and purification through suffering. They were known as the Flagellants, and for a time they spread like a living flame throughout Europe. But there was one place where that flame became uncontrollable. A place where their fervor reached levels of delirium and diverted into dangerous territories, even by the standards of the time. That place was Würzburg. In the mid-14th century, the city of Würzburg, located in the heart of the Holy Roman Empire, was an important spiritual center, ruled by prince-bishops who held both ecclesiastical and civil power. It was also a city struck by plagues, poverty, and fear. In that context, the Flagellants arrived as bearers of a radical response to a world that seemed to be collapsing. They came from other regions, crossing mountains and rivers, forming columns that sometimes exceeded hundreds of individuals, each dressed in white tunics stained with their own blood, with hoods covering their faces and whips in their hands. They organized themselves with almost military precision. They marched in silence, and upon arriving at a square, they would strip from the waist up and begin the ritual. Chroniclers of the time described Dantean scenes. Men hitting their backs over and over until the skin opened and blood began to flow like water. With each lash, they recited modified psalms, litanies in a dialect mixing vulgar Latin with unintelligible words. They said their voices were not their own, that ancient prophets, forgotten martyrs, or even fallen angels spoke through them. The people, at first, watched them with astonishment, then devotion, and finally fear. Because there was something in their gaze, in the intensity of their acts, that seemed to go beyond common penance. It was as if they sought something the Church could not offer them. something only found at the threshold of absolute pain. The city began to fill with rumors. It was said that some flagellants could heal diseases just by touching the sick, that others fell into trances and recited biblical passages that appeared in no known manuscript. There were those who claimed to have seen them walk on coals without burning or pronounce prophecies that later came true with disturbing precision. But with those rumors, suspicions also arose. Because the movement, which presented itself as a mystical reaction to the chaos of the world, began to behave like a closed sect, they obeyed no bishop. They recognized no authority of the Pope. They did not celebrate Mass nor accepted sacraments. They said the Church was corrupted, that the Holy Spirit had withdrawn from the Vatican and now dwelled among the Flagellants. According to them, the only path to redemption was pain, and the only truth was that revealed between lashes and chants. The Bishop of Würzburg, alarmed by the growing power of this group, ordered a secret investigation. Some of the documents survive the passage of time and reveal findings that puzzled even the inquisitors themselves. One report mentions that several members of the movement spoke of a second revelation, a text supposedly dictated to one of the leaders during a 40-day ecstasy. This document, known among them as the Gospel of the Flame, described an end of the world very different from the Apocalypse of John. It did not speak of trumpets or riders, but of purifying fire, cities turned into altars of blood, a new humanity born from pain. According to this text, the Flagellants were the chosen to guide that passage, not as saviors, but as voluntary martyrs, as living flames. What happened next was inevitable. The Church declared the movement heretical and ordered its dissolution. But instead of disappearing, the Flagellants of Würzburg locked themselves inside an ancient abandoned church on the outskirts of the city. They sealed the doors, cut off all contact with the outside world. They only came out on certain nights, marked by a full moon, sometimes covered with red cloaks, other times naked and covered in ashes, murmuring prayers no one recognized. The population began to avoid that area. Animals fled. Even soldiers sent to inspect the church returned disturbed, with wild eyes, unable to explain what they had seen. One of them wrote that he heard a song that did not seem human, as if the stone itself was praying. One night the church burned down for no apparent reason. The flames consumed the structure within hours. No bodies, objects, or manuscripts were found, only ashes and fragments of melted glass. It was said to be divine punishment, that God himself intervened to erase the error. But others think it was something else, that the Flagellants did not die, but achieved what they sought from the beginning, to transcend the body, to leave this world behind, to cross the last frontier that separates suffering from enlightenment. Since then, similar apparitions have been reported in other parts of Europe, always in times of crisis. Groups of people emerging from nowhere, dressed in white tunics, walking silently, and disappearing without a trace. Modern studies try to explain the phenomenon as a combination of religious fanaticism, collective psychiatric disorders, and an era deeply marked by death and fear. But there are details that do not fit. Because even centuries later, some researchers claim to have found symbols engraved in crypts of abandoned churches in Würzburg, identical to those described in the supposed Gospel of the Flame. There are stone carvings showing hooded figures surrounded by fire, and phrases written in a language that has not yet been deciphered. These are not conclusive proofs, but shadows that continue to be cast over history. The case of the Flagellants of Würzburg is one of those mysteries that not only defies logic, but disturbs the soul. Because deep down, what frightens is not physical pain nor heresy, but the possibility that there are people willing to leave everything behind, even their humanity, in search of a truth that perhaps cannot be put into words. A truth that bleeds, is sung, and ultimately is consumed in the fire. The Cursed Treasure of Rennes-le-Château. In the south of France, Atop a hill overlooking the landscape of Languedoc, surrounded by an air that seems thicker than usual and a silence heavier than it should be, lies the tiny village of Rennes-le-Château. At first glance, there is nothing extraordinary about this small town. A few stone houses, a modest church, dirt roads, and vineyards growing in the dry surroundings. But beneath that unremarkable appearance hides one of the most puzzling and enigmatic stories in Europe. A tale that mixes ecclesiastical secrets, hidden codes, lost fortunes, esoteric symbols, strange apparitions, and a cursed treasure that, according to many, has not been completely found, because perhaps it is not of this world. It all began in the year 1885, when a young priest named Bérenger Saunière was assigned as the pastor of the parish of Rennes-le-Château. It was a minor post in a poor village, with a ruined church and a small community barely able to sustain the clergyman's life. However, shortly after his arrival, something happened that changed the fate of the place forever. Saunière, who at first lived in extreme modesty, suddenly began to receive money. Not in small amounts, not sporadically, but in significant and constant sums. He completely restored the church, commissioned lavish decorations, built a villa called Villa Bethania, a private library, and financed trips, banquets, and extravagant masses. His wealth grew to a level that could not be justified by his salary or local donations. And when questioned by the diocese, Saunière offered no clear explanation, but he also did not seem worried. The legend began to take shape when the workers in charge of renovating the church reported that during the works, the priest had found something hidden in a Visigoth pillar supporting the altar. No one knew for sure what it was, but rumors spoke of ancient scrolls written in a strange Latin, accompanied by Kabbalistic symbols and encrypted lines that Saunière guarded with obsessive zeal. It is said that after this discovery, the priest began to behave erratically. He visited cemeteries at night, received unknown visitors from Paris and Marseille, and spent hours locked in his library reviewing books on alchemy, genealogy, and medieval heraldry. One of the strangest details was the symbolic transformation of the church of Rennes-le-Château. Instead of restoring it according to usual liturgical patterns, Saunière introduced baffling elements. The entrance was decorated with the inscription, "Terribilis est locus iste," a biblical quote which, translated, means, "This place is terrible," a phrase hardly fitting for a house of God. Inside, he placed statues of inverted angels, a demon named Asmodeus holding the holy water font, and a series of paintings and stained glass windows whose scenes seemed to tell a story parallel to the official one, as if housing a secret narrative only visible to those who knew how to interpret it. Over time, researchers, historians, occultists, and curious visitors began to come to Rennes-le-Château, trying to reconstruct the mystery. Theories multiplied. Some claimed that Saunière had found the lost treasure of the Templars, hidden in the Pyrenees since the order's fall. Others said it was compromising documents about the true descent of Jesus of Nazareth, protected for centuries by a secret network of initiates. Some believed the priest accessed forbidden knowledge, delivered by Visigoth manuscripts containing astrological keys and millennial predictions. Each version opens a different door, and none has been fully closed. One of the most unsettling hypotheses links the treasure of Rennes-le-Château with the figure of the Holy Grail. But not as a physical object, not as a golden cup hidden in a cave, but as a lineage, a bloodline, a genetic secret that would have been preserved in secrecy throughout the centuries. Saunière, upon finding evidence of that lineage in the discovered documents, would have been rewarded or silenced by an organization interested in keeping the balance of power intact. This line of thought led contemporary writers to connect Rennes-le-Château with the Priory of Sion, with esoteric Freemasonry, and with the mysteries of hidden Christian esotericism. What is fascinating about this case is that everything seems to border on plausibility. The documents exist. the inexplicable wealth as well. The symbolic transformation of the church can be seen with one's own eyes. The priest's correspondence, his travels, and bank records have been verified by historians. Yet no theory has been able to unify all the elements conclusively, as if the mystery resisted being solved, as if Saunière had left deliberately incomplete clues, designed to confuse the curious, to invite the search without ever allowing arrival at the final destination. The priest's own end further fuels the legend. In his final years, Saunière lived in seclusion, plagued by legal troubles and increasingly fragile health. But he never seemed remorseful for his actions, nor willing to reveal what he knew. On his deathbed, he asked for confession, but the priest who attended him refused to absolve him after hearing his last words. He claimed what he had heard was too grave, and that he preferred to bear the scandal of refusal rather than the responsibility of granting forgiveness. The secret died with Saunière. Or at least, that seems to be the case. Since then, Rennes-le-Château has become a pilgrimage site for those seeking answers in the folds of forgotten history. There have been clandestine excavations, nocturnal expeditions, studies of astronomical alignments among key geographic points in the area, and even terrain analysis using ground-penetrating radar technology. On more than one occasion, local authorities have had to intervene to prevent overly enthusiastic visitors from damaging the archaeological remains of the region. And despite all the media and academic attention, the enigma remains alive. Some say the treasure of Rennes-le-Château was never material, that it is a spiritual key, knowledge buried in plain sight, disguised as architecture, altered liturgy, symbols crossed between stained glass and columns. Others believe the curse of the place does not come from what Saunière found, but from the very act of having searched for it. That whoever delves too deeply into the mysteries of Rennes-le-Château inevitably ends up paying a price, whether in health, sanity, or soul. The villa built by the priest still stands. The church remains open. The strange decorations continue there, silently watching those who dare enter. And the hill, silent as always, observes from its height how centuries accumulate without bringing answers. Only more questions, only more mystery on the silence of Glastonbury Abbey. Deep in Somerset, in the southwest of England, rise the ruins of a place that, despite being worn down by time, continues to exert a hypnotic power over anyone who stands before its crumbling walls. There, where the stones seem to breathe with the mist and the earth vibrates with untold stories, lies Glastonbury Abbey, a place that has been many things over the centuries: a sanctuary, a fortress, a monastery, a tomb, a legend. But above all, it has been an enigma, a point where history and myth merge into such a thin line that trying to separate one from the other is like attempting to isolate a whisper within the wind. Glastonbury has been described as the cradle of Christianity in the British Isles, the place where, according to some traditions, Joseph of Arimathea arrived after the crucifixion of Christ, carrying the Holy Grail and planting a white thorn that still blooms every winter. It has also been said to be the tomb of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere, a claim that, although lacking conclusive evidence, fueled centuries of romantic fervor and impossible quests. But beyond these legendary tales, what truly makes Glastonbury Abbey unique is the silence that surrounds it. A silence that is not simply the absence of sound, but an active, heavy presence, as if what happened inside its walls could not be told in words. That silence begins to be noticed just as one crosses the limits of the site. The most sensitive visitors describe it as a change in the atmosphere, a sensation of being watched, not with hostility, but with an ancient, still attention. The birds seem to fall silent as one approaches, the wind slows down, and even the voices of tourists diminish to murmurs, as if something in the place demands respect or secrecy. Official history tells us that the abbey was one of the most important monasteries of the Middle Ages, with immense economic, political, and spiritual power. It was destroyed in the 16th century during the dissolution of the monasteries ordered by Henry VIII, in a brutal process that wiped out centuries of knowledge, liturgy, and art. But what is not so easily mentioned is that even before its fall, Glastonbury had already been the subject of strange rumors. The monks, despite their theoretically isolated life, maintained correspondence with alchemists from the continent, preserved forbidden texts, and it was said that on new moon nights, they held private rituals that did not follow traditional Catholic liturgy. One of the oldest documents mentioning this spiritual anomaly is a 14th century letter written by a Benedictine abbot who passed through Glastonbury on a pilgrimage. He describes an experience that would mark the rest of his life. He recounts that upon entering the abbey's library, he was warmly received by an elderly monk who offered him to spend the night in an empty cell. At midnight, he was startled awake by a chant. Not a polyphonic or ecclesiastical chant, but a solitary masculine chant, with a voice that seemed to come from beneath the ground. It was a low, sustained tone, without lyrics or recognizable melody. When he went out to the hallway, he found no one. The most unsettling discovery was that in the morning, the monk who had received him was not listed in the records. No brother of the community had occupied that cell for years. That episode was dismissed as a hallucination, like many others. But over the years, the stories repeated. Visitors claimed to hear prayers in unknown tongues, see lights moving among the underground crypts, feel sudden temperature changes when passing certain stones. Some even claimed to have seen figures dressed in white, silently crossing the main nave, with faces covered by black hoods. None of these testimonies were taken seriously by religious authorities. But among the villagers, there was always the certainty that Glastonbury was not just an abbey, but a frontier. In the 20th century, when more systematic archaeological explorations began, new elements increased the strangeness. Beneath the foundations of the main church, much older structures than the official monastery founding were discovered. Buried columns, sealed chambers, tunnels whose orientation does not follow Christian architectural logic. Some archaeologists believe Glastonbury was built atop an ancient Celtic temple dedicated to an unknown deity, perhaps female, perhaps linked to water or death. This would explain the unusual concentration of wells, springs, and underground channels in the area, many of which remain active and emit sounds that have been recorded as atypical acoustic phenomena. One of the most unsettling is the so-called echo of the cross, a reverberation that occurs when a specific word, whose meaning has not yet been deciphered, is pronounced in one of the ancient side chapels. Instead of dissipating as normally happens, the sound bounces between the stones with increased intensity, as if the space were designed to amplify certain syllables. Some acoustic researchers suggest the phenomenon may be related to the shape of the vaults and building materials. Others, however, believe it responds to a lost key, a kind of sonic password capable of activating something more. The monks of Glastonbury disappeared centuries ago, but the silence remains intact. Some believe that silence is what remains when a place has witnessed too many things beyond human understanding, that it is a kind of memory, a memory that cannot be verbalized but is still felt. The dreams of those who spend the night near the site tend to be intense, filled with symbolic images, doors opening in darkness, endless tunnels, faceless female figures extending their hands, pitchers pouring endlessly. Dozens of testimonies have been collected that, without having crossed paths, coincide in these very elements, as if the place transmits a story that no one has yet fully understood. Today, Glastonbury Abbey is a tourist destination, a landmark for spiritual seekers, lovers of Celtic mysticism, and followers of the Arthurian legend. But among those who have devoted their lives to studying its secrets, there is a disturbing certainty that the most important thing about Glastonbury is not in what it shows, but in what it keeps silent. That its silence is not an absence, but an ancient, careful, patient presence, a presence that perhaps waits for someone to say the right word, touch the right stone, or listen enough. And if that happens, perhaps the silence will break, or perhaps it will speak. The Obsidian Child of Toledo. Toledo is a city where time does not flow linearly, but rather seems to fold back on itself, where one street can take you to the 16th century and another to a corner that appears to belong to no era at all. There, the layers of history are not buried. They are superimposed, as if the ground refuses to forget. It is a city that has been Roman, Visigoth, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, a crucible so dense that, in certain corners, the air feels thicker, as if it is difficult to breathe amid so much accumulated memory. In that setting, where stone murmurs and shadows seem to remember, a legend arose that few dare to tell without lowering their voices. The story of the Obsidian Child. It is said that it all began with an excavation in the 1930s, when a group of workers was renovating an old house in the Jewish quarter. The building had been closed for years, almost devoured by ivy, with boarded-up windows and a door that seemed sealed more by fear than abandonment. No one remembered exactly who had lived there, although the oldest neighbor spoke of a retired doctor, a solitary scholar who had come from Salamanca decades earlier and rarely left his home. When he died, the place was shut down without anyone claiming his legacy. During the work to reinforce the foundations, the workers found something strange. An underground chamber with no visible access from the house, sealed with black volcanic stone carved with symbols that no one could clearly identify. What they found upon opening that chamber marked the beginning of the mystery. In the center of the room, placed on a white marble pedestal, lay a figure that at first glance appeared to be an anthropomorphic statue. It was the size of a small child, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, and was carved entirely from polished obsidian, so perfectly smooth that it reflected light like a distorted mirror. But it was not a common sculpture. The figure seemed alive, not in a literal sense, but in a magnetic one. In the immediate and inexplicable impulse to look away and, at the same time, not be able to stop staring. Disturbed, the workers notified the authorities, and soon archaeologists, historians, and clergy arrived. The first thing that caught their attention was the perfection of the workmanship. No known medieval tool could have carved obsidian with such precision, especially not in a piece of that size. Moreover, upon close examination, they noticed unsettling details. The child's eyelids were closed, but there was a slight, barely perceptible gap between them, as if they were about to open. The stone skin was carved with veins barely suggested, and the lips showed an ambiguous curve between a smile and a grimace of anguish. The strangest thing, however, was what happened when they tried to move it. The figure weighed much more than its volume suggested, as if the stone contained an anomalous density, as if its center was not entirely of this world. The object was transported with difficulty to the Santa Cruz Museum, where it remained for a few days before being mysteriously withdrawn. During its brief exhibition, several visitors reported feeling ill near the sculpture, dizziness, cold sweats, recurring dreams that same night. Some children cried upon seeing it, for no apparent reason. An elderly woman claimed to have heard a voice inside her head when she stopped in front of it. And a night guard stated that he saw one of its fingers move, although he later refused to speak further on the matter. Officially, the figure was sent to Madrid for study, but records end there. There is no formal evidence that it ever arrived at the Archaeological Museum or any other research center. It is as if it had been erased from the inventory of history. Yet its trail was not completely lost. In certain private circles linked to occultism and forbidden history, the Obsidian Child is still spoken of as an entity, not as an art piece, as something created with a purpose or found in a place where it should not have been. The most unsettling theory is the one linking it to an anonymous 15th century grimoire, fragmentarily preserved in a private collection in Toledo. It mentions a black infant of silence, an anthropomorphic figure carved in volcanic stone that, according to tradition, contains a trapped soul. The text speaks of a ritual performed by a sage who defied the boundary between the living and the dead, who sealed inside the figure the spirit of a child victim of a sacrifice. This being, the grimoire says, remains asleep as long as no one names it. But if its true name is spoken in front of it, it will awaken, not as a physical creature, but as a presence, a consciousness that can extend beyond its form, that can speak, observe, learn. The most puzzling detail is that on one of the margins of the grimoire appears an illegible signature, but whose handwriting matches annotations found in a notebook inside the house where the sculpture was discovered. The notebook, although in poor condition, contained drawings of symbols identical to those engraved in the stone, along with dates, coordinates, and a phrase repeated several times. "He does not sleep. He only waits." Since then, there have been sporadic reports of appearances of a similar figure in other parts of the world. In 1970, a Mexican archaeologist claimed to have seen an identical figure in a cave in Oaxaca during an expedition that was interrupted by a landslide. In 1992, a German collector published an article in a specialized magazine about an idol he had acquired on the black market, described with astonishing similarity. He never published anything again. He committed suicide a few months later. His note said simply, "Now I know he is watching me." In Toledo, the story has not been forgotten. Some say the figure was hidden in a crypt beneath a desacralized church, or that it was returned to its place of origin, resealed in the underground chamber with layers of lead and salt. Others believe it was destroyed, although no one dares to affirm that for certain. The only sure thing is that since then, no one has opened that house again. And even though it is boarded up, some neighbors say they have seen a faint light turn on sometimes inside. A light that should not be there, a light that flickers, as if someone, or something, is breathing in the darkness. The Obsidian Child is not just a story of archaeology or superstition. It is the trace of something that escapes known categories, something that is neither alive nor dead, but waits. Something that was found, yes, but perhaps should never have been awakened. The Forbidden Library of Constantinople. There are places that do not disappear when they are destroyed. Places whose essence dissolves over time, but whose shadow remains suspended, floating between the cracks of history. Constantinople was such a city. The jewel of the ancient world, the crossroads of empires, the last bastion of Rome, and the threshold between East and West. And at its heart, among the halls of power and golden temples, there existed a library that few knew in life, and even fewer remembered afterward. The Forbidden Library. The one that, it is said, did not appear in records, did not open its doors to everyone, and whose existence was more rumor than institution. But its effects, its secrets, its disappearances, those were very real. When one thinks of legendary libraries, it is usual to look toward Alexandria, that Atlantis of ancient knowledge lost among ashes. But in the shadows of the following centuries, Constantinople took up that fire and hid it. There, within the walls of the New Rome, arose a network of archives, codices, and writings whose access was reserved not for scholars, but for the initiated. Officially, the Imperial Library of Constantinople was founded in the 4th century, under the reign of Constantius II, as an attempt to collect and protect the great texts of classical antiquity that had survived persecution, censorship, and the fragility of the times. It was an organized institution, maintained by scribes, philosophers, and scholars who worked tirelessly to translate and preserve. But among the visible corridors of that library, rumors pointed to another level, one that was not open to the public nor mentioned in documents. A hidden collection, not in the physical sense, although that too, but in the symbolic. Texts that were neither lent nor discussed. papyri locked in chests, treatises enclosed behind iron doors, and words sealed with symbols that were neither Greek nor Roman. It was said that there were forbidden works gathered there by the church, Gnostic manuscripts, suppressed gospels, Orphic texts, and fragments of civilizations that appeared in no other record. The knowledge that had been banished from the surface, it was said, still breathed in the basements of Constantinople. The existence of this parallel library was transmitted through private letters among alchemists, marginal notes in medieval codices, and veiled chronicles that spoke of the basement of mirrors, the gallery without lamps, or the archive where light does not enter. The fascinating thing is that these mentions, separated by centuries and continents, coincided in some unsettling details. They spoke of an octagonal room buried beneath the imperial forum, where texts were read aloud in whispers by readers who did not write. They spoke of a codex without a name that could only be opened by someone who had dreamed of it beforehand. And they also spoke of disappearances, because the history of this library is not only a story of books, but of people, of scholars who were invited to Constantinople with the promise of consulting lost documents and never returned, of monks who abandoned their orders after a stay there, claiming that the truth is too great for this world, of scribes who lost their sight or their minds after transcribing certain pages. Byzantine chronicles, which often mix history with symbolism, mention a certain Basil the Dark, a reader found in a fetal position, surrounded by torn parchments and murmuring senseless phrases in multiple languages. His body trembled at contact with light. No one could explain what he had read. One of the most mentioned texts among the supposed treasures of this library was the Gospel of the Serpent, a heretical manuscript attributed to the early centuries of Christianity that spoke of a different revelation, in which the serpent of Eden was not an evil figure, but the bearer of true knowledge. Another cited text was the Book of Internal Time, a treatise on cosmology that described parallel universes, not as distant places, but as simultaneous states of consciousness, attainable through specific rites. There was also talk of an incomplete translation of the Book of Thoth, linked to an Egyptian version never known to modern archaeologists, and whose existence no one has been able to confirm outside of those cryptic mentions. And then the year 1204 arrived. The Fourth Crusade, in a treacherous twist of history, did not march on Jerusalem, but on Constantinople. The city, which had never fallen to barbarians nor caliphs, was ravaged by those who claimed to defend the faith. For 3 days the city was looted, profaned, and stripped. Churches burned, relics stolen, archives destroyed, and among them, it is said, disappeared the last traces of that secret library. There have been accounts of crusaders opening stone doors and carrying away chests sealed with Kabbalistic signs. It is said that some works were secretly transferred to monasteries in the north, to vaults in the Vatican, and into the hands of Central European alchemists. What is most perplexing is that, during the following centuries, new texts began to appear in Europe. Books that claimed to have been recently written but contained ideas and symbols found only in obscure references of the Eastern tradition. Some of those books were considered blasphemous and burned without trial. Others circulated among secret societies, and a few have reached our days, marked by an air of mystery that has not dissipated. Today, the ruins of ancient Constantinople lie beneath Istanbul, a modern city that walks upon the footprints of buried empires. Many of the original structures were demolished or rebuilt, but there are archaeologists who claim that the tunnels remain there, sealed, unexplored, beneath the streets, beneath the mosques, beneath the houses. The possibility that part of that library, or of what it once was, still exists, remains alive. There are those who believe it was never a library in the physical sense, that it was a code, a network of scattered texts, connected by readers who knew how to interpret them. Others, more daring, think it was a living library, that what was read there was not ink on parchment, but a deeper language. Something that responded to the reader, that transformed them, that opened doors that could not be closed. And if that was the case, then it is likely that what disappeared were not books, but keys. Keys that open doors we no longer understand. Doors that might still be among us, waiting for someone, once again, to dare to seek them. The faces in the stone of Rosslyn. A few kilometers south of Edinburgh, surrounded by the persistent mist of the Scottish lowlands and the endless whisper of the wind through ancient trees, stands a chapel that seems more like a stone riddle than a religious temple. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century, does not impress by its size, but by the intensity with which it seems to watch the visitor. Every column, every arch, every corner appears charged with intention, as if the stones that compose it were not simply carved, but summoned, as if they were waiting. Although many stories surround Rosslyn, Templars, Masons, ley lines, secret codices, there is a lesser-known mystery, yet even more disturbing. The faces, not those of saints sculpted in celestial glory nor of idealized angels, but others different. Human figures, small portraits hidden among the capitals, moldings, and vaulted ceilings. Anonymous faces, some serene, others grotesque. Some childlike in appearance, others with the gaze of impossible old age. But what makes them unsettling is not their presence, but their resemblance. The first reports about the faces began to appear in the years following the partial restoration of the chapel in the 19th century. The restorers, while cleaning centuries of buildup, discovered human faces carved with an unusual level of detail hidden among acanthus leaves, snake knots, and floral motifs. What puzzled the experts was the modern expression of some of those faces, as if they did not belong to the medieval era, as if someone had carved them centuries later, imitating present-day features. A local historian was the first to notice that one of the faces looked strikingly like a member of the restoration team. It was thought to be a coincidence, an illusion caused by human subjectivity. But soon more coincidences began to appear. A visitor claimed that a figure protruding from a window frame was identical to his deceased father. A woman believed she recognized herself in a sculpture hidden in the corner of a column. The feeling of being watched was not just symbolic. Some felt they were facing their own reflection, but in stone. One of the strangest cases occurred in 1973, when a group of Japanese tourists took a series of photographs inside the chapel. When developing the images, they found on one of the columns the face of an Asian man, perfectly defined, which none of them had noticed in person. Alarmed, they returned days later, but could not find the carving. Some said it had been erased, others that it was never there. But the image exists and is preserved in a private archive in Kyoto. There is a theory, circulating among scholars of the occult and Masonic symbolism, suggesting that Rosslyn was built following principles that transcend conventional architecture. That its builders did not merely erect walls, but encoded information into the very form of the stones, as if the chapel were not just a temple, but a machine, a structure capable of storing more than shapes, something like memories or faces. This idea is supported by the complexity of Rosslyn's design. There are columns that lead nowhere, staircases that end abruptly, windows placed in impossible positions for light to enter, and a central column, the famous Apprentice's Column, whose legend tells of a sculptor murdered by his master for having created a work too perfect. Some scholars believe that story is not literal, but a metaphor, that the column represents a connection to knowledge beyond time, and that the faces scattered throughout the chapel are a consequence of that connection. It has even been spoken of a resonant stone hidden beneath the altar, capable of recording human vibrations, of absorbing not only sounds but presences, of projecting over time psychic impressions into the matter surrounding it. If this theory were true, the faces that appear would not have been carved by human hands, but manifested by the chapel itself, as if it were a living being that remembers those who visit it. An entity that keeps not ideas, but faces. A spiritual archive carved in stone. There are records of people who, after visiting Rosslyn, claim to have dreamed of figures they later found in photographs of the chapel. Mental images that seem to have been planted in their unconscious during the visit. Some attribute it to suggestion. Others, to a form of hypermnesia induced by the symbolism of the place. But there are those who go further and speak of a more radical phenomenon. That Rosslyn is a point of intersection, a node where the lines of time weaken, and where what was, what is, and what will be can mutually filter. At that crossing, the faces do not belong to an era. They are those who have been there, those who will be there, those who watch. In 2009, a restorer discovered beneath a layer of mold a series of carvings that seemed to have been added recently. They were 5 faces, all different, sculpted with a technique identical to the original but with a detail that puzzled everyone. One of them wore glasses. Modern glasses, with a metal frame. The most disturbing thing is that the restorer disappeared from the project a week later, and although there were no formal accusations, many believe she was forced to keep silent. The carving was officially removed for being considered an act of vandalism. But several photographs circulated before it was erased, clearly showing the face of a young woman with an expression of astonishment and glasses too contemporary for a medieval temple. Today, thousands of people visit Rosslyn every year. Most marvel at its symbols, its details, its mystical aura. But there are some who, upon leaving, walk in silence, heads bowed, as if something inside them had changed. Some never return. Others come back again and again, as if they are searching for something they left there, or something that waits for them there. Because Rosslyn is not just a chapel. It is a stone mirror, one that does not return the physical image, but a deeper one. A portrait that sometimes manifests without permission, without reason, without logic. And when that happens, the question that floats in the air is as unsettling as it is inevitable. Who is really watching whom? The Labyrinth of the Blind Monk, in a remote abbey perched on the cliffs of the Apulia region in southern Italy, where the wind blows with a force that seems to carry not only sand, but also whispers from the past. There existed for centuries an underground structure whose existence was only mentioned in hushed tones among the brothers of the monastery. A place that was not spoken of during the daylight hours, and into which no one descended without a reason as powerful as it was dangerous. They called it the Labyrinth of the Blind Monk, and although it did not appear on any maps, everyone knew it was there. Beneath, waiting. The legend began with a man. His name, or at least the one recorded, was Benedetto da Montecassino, although some doubt that was his real name. The only certainty is that he arrived at the monastery in the year 1232, walking alone, wearing a tattered robe and with completely white eyes. They said he had been blind from birth, yet his way of moving was precise, as if his feet remembered the path before his mind did. He was accepted by the order after demonstrating a surprising knowledge of the scriptures and an unsettling ease in memorizing complex texts. In a short time, he became the monastery's librarian, despite his blindness. But Benedetto did not limit himself to preserving books. He spoke of things the other monks did not understand. Structures hidden beneath the earth, scriptures older than Christianity, buried lines crossing under monasteries like veins of the world. He claimed that beneath the abbey there was a labyrinth, not just a mere construction, but a living writing in stone that held secrets as ancient as time itself. For years he insisted on this, and although many considered him a misguided mystic, his words were not forgotten. It was in the winter of 1245 when the first descent took place. Benedetto asked permission from the abbot to conduct excavations in the crypts, claiming to have had a revelation during his nightly prayers. He was granted access, more out of compassion than faith, and for weeks he worked with a small group of novices, opening sealed passages, moving stone blocks, following what he described as a guide given by silence. What they found was not a chamber nor a basement, but a spiral descending tunnel, carved with symbols that belonged to no known language. As they descended, the walls seemed to change color, from white limestone to a dark, almost black rock that absorbed the light of their torches. The descent continued for days. The tunnel did not go straight down, but curved, branched, doubled back on itself, forming a pattern without apparent logic. The novices began to have nightmares, to talk in their sleep, to wake with bloody hands without remembering how. One of them disappeared. Benedetto forbade further descent, but stayed below alone for 7 days. When he returned, he was gaunt, thinner, and although blind from birth, he covered his eyes with bandages, as if he still feared what he could not see. From then on, access to the labyrinth was sealed with stone and wax seals. Only Benedetto descended, once a week, always alone, and always in silence. He never explained what he did down there, but it was said he could recite entire books after a single reading, spoke languages that were not human, and that some animals avoided crossing his shadow. The monks, though fearful, began to venerate him as a sage. However, his behavior began to change. He no longer prayed with the others. He avoided sunlight. He ate very little and barely slept. One night, he carved a circle with symbols on the floor of the library and sat inside it for hours, whispering endless phrases. The monastery began to deteriorate from within, not structurally, but in its spirit. The monks fell ill without apparent cause. Some lost the ability to speak. Others locked themselves in their cells and refused to come out. The prayers lost meaning. Mass repeated like an empty echo. The abbot asked the bishopric for help, but when the envoys arrived, Benedetto had already disappeared. The entrance to the labyrinth was open, with no trace of the blind monk. Only his staff remained, leaning against the wall, and a phrase written in ash on the floor. He who descends no longer rises. He who sees never returns. They sealed the entrance again, not with stone, but with fire. They demolished part of the crypt, filled it with earth and salt, and consecrated the place with a mass that lasted 3 days. The labyrinth was never mentioned officially again. The monastery closed shortly afterward, victim of a sudden plague that did not affect nearby villages. The buildings were abandoned, and over time, vegetation and oblivion did their work. Only ruins remained. But not all was lost. In the 19th century, a Neapolitan antiquarian found, among the remains of an ecclesiastical library, an unsigned manuscript describing a spiral system of tunnels filled with inscriptions impossible to translate. The author claimed to have descended in dreams to a place buried in living stone, where the walls whispered prayers in a voice made up of many voices, and where a faceless monk waited sitting, as if he had spent centuries awaiting a question no one dared to ask. The manuscript was never published, but it circulated in private copies, and some scholars of the occult consider it one of the most enigmatic references of the European mystical tradition. To this day, the labyrinth has not been rediscovered. The ruins of the monastery still stand in a remote corner of southern Italy, visited only by the curious chasing legends. Some claim to have heard echoes beneath the earth. Others say they have seen symbols carved into the stones along the path. No one has excavated, at least officially. But the place still holds that heavy air, that tension felt in sites where time has been altered, where something was awakened unintentionally. And the name Benedetto da Monte Cassino continues to be whispered in certain circles, not as that of a madman, but as that of a guardian, the last reader of the labyrinth. the one who, without eyes, saw more than anyone else could bear. The black mirrors of the plague doctors, in the heart of medieval Europe, among cobblestone cities where the air smelled of rancid wax, incense, and despair, figures emerged that still provoke unease simply by being mentioned. The plague doctors, those beings covered in black robes, gloves, wide-brimmed hats, and the infamous bird-like beak that crowned their faces like a raven's mask serving death. Their mere presence was synonymous with imminent tragedy. Wherever they walked, the plague had already arrived. But there is a detail that rarely appears in the engravings or medical treatises of the time, and yet has survived among the darkest folds of European folklore: the black mirrors. Few official documents mention them, but in the personal diaries of some inhabitants of Florence, Prague, Paris, and Lisbon, fleeting descriptions appear, filled with fear. It is said that some plague doctors carried small dark discs, round, which were not made of common glass, but of polished obsidian or a mixture of sulfur, lead, and ash, whose shine was dull, like that of a sick pupil. They were mirrors without reflections, it was said, instruments that did not return the image of whoever looked into them, but something else, something deeper, more intimate, something that should not be seen. Medieval medicine was a blend of primitive science, superstition, alchemy, astrology, and prayer. It was believed that bad humors, emanations from corrupt bodies, and astral influences were as valid causes as the bacteria no one could see. In this context, the figure of the doctor became half wise man, half exorcist. Their role was not only to cure, but also to understand the hidden signs of disease, to read bodies as if they were maps and the eyes of the sick as if they were portals. And it is in this intersection between emerging science and the arcane that these mirrors appear. Oral tradition links them to a lost school of Italian doctors, which supposedly arose in the Salerno region, but operated clandestinely, apart from formal academia. According to some accounts, this group sought not so much to cure as to diagnose the soul. They claimed that the plague was not only a physical disease, but a spiritual rupture, an invasion of the invisible over the flesh, and to understand its origin, they used these black mirrors during the night vigil, placing them in front of the most serious patients, observing not the face, but what the mirror projected on its surface. Some claimed to see stains that changed shape, shadows that mimicked the dying person's gestures, figures that appeared only during the last breath. But the most unsettling thing was not what was seen in them, but what the doctors themselves experienced. There are reports, almost always in the form of private letters or confessions hidden in the margins of manuscripts, that speak of visions that did not dissolve with the dawn. One of these texts, attributed to a certain Frère Dominique, a 14th century French doctor, mentions that after staring for 3 nights into his black mirror, he began to see faces on the walls of his cell. Faces that did not belong to anyone alive, and that watched him with an intensity that prevented him from sleeping. Finally, he broke the object and buried the fragments in consecrated ground, although he claimed that even after that, his reflection never looked like himself again. Not all the mirrors survived. Many were destroyed when the epidemics waned, as if their mere existence could attract misfortune. However, some are known to have passed into the hands of private collectors, alchemists, or occult societies. The most famous was one found in an abandoned abbey in the Bavarian region during the 18th century. It was a perfectly round obsidian disc, framed in silver blackened by time. Its surface did not shine but absorbed the light. The monks who found it offered it to a local noble as a gift, but he, after receiving it, suffered a violent fever for 3 days and died without apparent medical reason. The mirror disappeared again, and its trail was lost in the black market of cursed objects. Over the centuries, black mirrors have been associated with many esoteric practices. John Dee, advisor to Queen Elizabeth I of England and one of the best-known occultists of the Renaissance, used one to communicate with what he called Enochian angels. but those of the plague doctors had a different nature. They were not used to summon, but to reveal. They were not doors, but membranes. Surfaces where what hides beneath the skin could be shown without censorship. The question, of course, is whether all this is part of a later mythology, a construction born from fear and the desire to attribute hidden meanings to one of history's greatest tragedies. And yet, there are details too concrete. The fact that the mirrors are described in such distant places with similar terms. Speculum silenti, luna mortua, mirror of lament. That their use is linked to common symptoms, migraines, loss of appetite, insomnia, depersonalization, suggests a shared experience, not an isolated invention. Even today, there are curious testimonies from collectors and private museums claiming to possess fragments of these objects. Always with the same warning: they must not be looked into directly. They must not be used at night. And above all, they must not be placed in front of a sick body. Some believe that what the black mirrors reflect is that which refuses to die. That the plague, like fear or the soul, does not disappear. It only changes its face. That the true contagion was not bacterial, but symbolic. An energy that, once released, sought to remain attached to any form that could sustain it. Today, plague doctor costumes are exhibited in museums as grotesque pieces of a brutal past. Their methods, errors, and primitive contributions are studied, but almost no one speaks of the mirrors, as if mentioning them was a way to activate them, as if in some corner of the world one still remains unbroken, wrapped in black cloth, waiting for someone to hold it again, to gaze into its mute surface and discover, too late, that there are things that should never have been seen. Because not all reflections are ours. Some watch us from the other side, and they never close their eyes. The underground church of Orvieto, high atop a volcanic plateau in the heart of Italy, surrounded by vineyards, early mists, and the echo of centuries that refuse to die, stands the city of Orvieto. From the outside, it looks like a fortress petrified by time, with its imposing Gothic cathedral and its medieval cobblestone alleys winding like ancient veins. But what few know, and even fewer understand, is that the true heart of Orvieto does not beat in the sunlight, but deep within its bowels. An underground world stretching hundreds of meters beneath the surface, as old as mystery itself. And at the center of that stone labyrinth, hidden among tunnels carved in volcanic tuff, there is a temple that does not appear on maps, nor in books, nor on tourist routes. A buried church, silent, awake. They call it the Underground Church of Orvieto. Officially, the underground city was rediscovered last century when a group of archaeologists, following reports of medieval tunnels used during sieges, began excavating beneath the old town. What they found surpassed any expectation. A network of over 1,000 chambers, corridors, wells, cisterns, pottery workshops, underground mills, and even pigeon lofts, built over more than 2,000 years, from the Etruscan era to the Middle Ages. However, it was not the practical use of these cavities that caught the attention of some more curious researchers, but certain anomalies. Areas of the underground that did not match known architectural logic, entrances sealed with carefully placed stones, walls leading nowhere, unless one knew where to look. One of these researchers, a retired professor of religious history from the University of Perugia named Lorenzo Bacci, became obsessed with a series of inscriptions found in a particularly deep chamber. The marks were not in Latin, nor in Etruscan, nor in any known classical language. They were circular symbols, almost like mandalas, carved with unsettling precision. After years of study, Bacci concluded that these signs seemed related to ancient Christian initiation rites predating the Council of Nicaea, when different versions of Christianity still coexisted. Many later declared heretical and brutally persecuted. It was then that he began to speak of the buried chapel. His colleagues treated him with skepticism. Some accused him of delirium in search of notoriety. But Bacci insisted. Beneath Orvieto, beyond the galleries open to the public, existed a sacred enclosure deliberately hidden, not out of fear of invaders, but out of fear of its power. A place where a mystical Christianity was practiced, different from the one consolidated by the Church, a Christianity based not on suffering, but on the inner transformation of the soul, where symbols were not worshipped, but inhabited, where the Mass was silence and the altar a mirror of the cosmos. In 1994, Bacci disappeared without a trace. His apartment was found intact, his research incomplete, and his name fell into oblivion. Some claim he was about to reveal the exact location of the underground church. Others believe he found it and never came out again. And yet, some urban explorers and seekers of the occult claim to have seen it. Scattered accounts, spoken cautiously, describe a hidden entrance at the base of a dry Etruscan well, sealed with a spiral symbol. They say that upon descending, the air changes, that the silence is so thick it weighs on the bones, that at the bottom, beyond a narrow passage of damp rock, opens a circular room. The walls covered with frescoes untouched by light for centuries, depicting biblical scenes in a style that is neither Byzantine nor Romanesque, but something far more abstract. Human figures wrapped in sacred geometry, eyes floating without faces, crosses suspended in fiery mandorlas. In the center of the room, a structure of polished stone, which might seem like an altar, if not for its shape. An ellipse, more like a sarcophagus. There are no images of the crucified Christ, no saints or martyrs, only patterns of light, of symmetry, as if the art of the place was meant not to worship, but to remember, as if those who gathered there did not pray, but remembered who they were, or what they were, before forgetting. Some hold that this underground temple was the work of a Gnostic branch, perhaps linked to the earliest Christians who saw divinity as an inner spark, not an external entity. Others believe it is older, perhaps of Etruscan origin, adapted by early followers of Christ before his figure was institutionalized. There are even those who connect it with the Cathars and propose that an unknown branch fled to Italy before the massacre at Montségur, founding a spiritual refuge in the depths of Orvieto. Whatever its origin, all agree on one point. The church was deliberately sealed, not out of fear of being discovered, but as a ritual act, as if the time had come to keep the knowledge, to lock it in stone until humanity was ready to hear it again. Some fragments of frescoes seem to depict precisely that act: hooded monks closing doors, covering walls with symbols, extinguishing torches. And then the most unsettling possibility arises. What if the temple is still alive? If it is not simply a religious ruin, but a space activated by human presence? If, as Bacci believed, that place was not built to worship a god, but to awaken an ancient memory buried within each of us, a memory that, when touched, transforms us. In Orvieto, the ancient inhabitants spoke of the breathing stone, a way of referring to the echo heard in certain tunnels when all is silent. They say that if one remains still, they can hear something that is neither wind nor water. A rhythm, a subtle vibration, as if the city itself beat from below. Perhaps that pulse comes from the sealed temple, or perhaps from what sleeps inside it. Today, official access to the underground is controlled, and the authorities deny the existence of any chambers outside the tourist routes. But rumors persist. Some claim that during certain solstices, the dawn light penetrates through a crack atop the plateau and reaches the exact spot where the underground altar would be, illuminating the stone for a few minutes. Like a sign, like a call, or a warning. And so the underground church of Orvieto remains, silent, sealed, waiting not to be rediscovered by excavators or curious tourists, but by someone capable of understanding what it holds. because there are temples that were not built to be seen, but to be remembered. And whoever enters them leaves not with answers, but with questions they can no longer ignore. The cemetery that rejects the dead. There is a remote corner in southern Europe where death apparently finds no rest. A place where the very ground seems to have awareness, where graves open by themselves, bodies do not decompose as they should, and coffins are returned to the surface with a gesture that does not seem accidental but deliberate. It is called, in whispers, the cemetery that rejects the dead, and although its exact location is never revealed with certainty, some place it in the Catalan Pyrenees, others in the forgotten fields of Tuscany, or among the olive groves of some Andalusian village. The accounts describing it are constant and agree on the essential details. The oldest records about this cemetery appear in rural chronicles from the 17th century, not in official books or ecclesiastical documents, but in letters, confessions of traveling monks, and diaries of doctors who roamed the dusty roads between parishes. One particular case, dated in the year 1683, narrates the burial of a young woman who died suddenly from a high fever. Her body was placed in the grave, following the proper rituals, and sealed with a simple tombstone. 3 days later, the gravedigger found the coffin exposed on the grass, just as he had left it, without signs of exhumation, without human footprints in the damp soil. Thinking it was the work of grave robbers, he buried it again. But the scene repeated itself. Once, twice, 3 times. Horrified, the family decided to bury her in another cemetery several kilometers away. There, finally, the body rested without incident. The story might have remained a strange anecdote, a product of popular folklore, if not for the fact that similar cases began to multiply. Over decades, more reports of rejected corpses appeared, bodies that did not remain underground even when graves were reinforced with stone. Some coffins were found in a vertical position, as if pushed up from below with slow but determined force. Others opened for no reason, revealing intact bodies, without traces of decomposition, as if death itself had stopped upon contact with that soil. Attempts to investigate the phenomenon were few and discreet. A religious order based in Bordeaux sent at the end of the 18th century a brother expert in ritual exhumations. His report is baffling. He speaks of earth cold to the touch, even under the midday sun, roots growing in the opposite direction, toward the surface, and a constant feeling of pressure on the chest while at the site. He found no evidence of desecration or sabotage, but he did record that during his visit, a recent burial also failed. The coffin of a child was found outside the grave at dawn, without a single footprint around. One of the most unsettling aspects is that the phenomenon does not seem to affect all bodies equally. Some remain buried without trouble, while others are rejected again and again. And here the story becomes darker. According to locals, there is a secret logic in the rejection, a kind of judgment that the cemetery seems to make, without visible criteria. Some claim that only those who die with hatred, remorse, or betrayal in their souls are expelled. Others, more superstitious, believe the cemetery has memory and only accepts those who have not harmed the earth or its creatures. There are even those who suggest it is an ancient curse, inherited from remote times when the place was not a cemetery, but a pagan sanctuary. Some archaeologists have tried to dig deeper, but reports are confusing. The terrain, although apparently stable, changes. The geological layers show anomalies. There are areas where the earth behaves like quicksand and others so compact that no instrument can pierce it. Human bone remains have been found in impossible positions, spiral skeletons, bodies with bones oriented upwards, and in one case, a skull perfectly embedded in a stone, as if the stone had absorbed it. None of these findings have been published in academic journals. All were leaked through unofficial channels and personal accounts. Throughout the 20th century, with the advance of rationalism and the discrediting of the paranormal, the cemetery was progressively forgotten. The nearby population emigrated. The church that guarded it was closed due to lack of parishioners, and the burial ground was left to the mercy of time. But the mystery persisted. Some solitary travelers, hikers, or photographers who came to the place by accident reported strange experiences. One spoke of hearing his own footsteps doubled, as if someone else were walking beside him. Another swore to have seen lights beneath the ground, pulsing, as if something was breathing. A woman found an open coffin, completely new, without a body, without a name, as if it were waiting for her. There is no official record of the cemetery. Local authorities ignore it. Tourist guides do not mention it. But some old, hand-drawn maps mark a circle in that area with a cryptic note. Here the dead do not want to stay. It may be legend, collective invention, or even a warning older than we think. The truth is that there are places in the world where the boundary between life and death does not behave as it should, where the passage is not one way, where the body refuses to merge with the earth. And in those places, burial rituals cease to make sense. Because what happens when the earth decides that the body does not belong to it? What does it mean when the soil, instead of welcoming, returns? Some say that this cemetery does not reject the dead as punishment, but out of compassion, that there are souls not yet ready, that they still have something to do, that they must stay, wander a little longer, because their story did not end when their eyes closed, and that the earth, wise in its silence, simply knows this. But whatever the truth may be, no one has been buried there for years. The ground is covered with wild grass, the graves are covered with moss, and the rusted iron crosses lean as if they wanted to leave as well. And yet, on certain nights, someone claims to see figures standing beside the tombstones. They do not cry, they do not pray, they just stand, as if waiting for someone someday to discover why death, in that place, is not allowed to stay. The shadow of the prior in Durham. High on a hill in northeast England, right where the River Wear makes a whimsical curve, stands Durham Cathedral, one of the jewels of European Romanesque architecture, majestic, yet melancholic, with its towers piercing the gray sky and stone weathered by centuries of prayer, storms, and silence. But if one enters with enough attention, if one steps into the echoes resonating beneath its arches and lets their footsteps blend with those of the past, they realize something. There is a presence there that does not belong to this time. A persistent trace that wanders the cloisters when no one is there. A shadow moving without body or origin. They call it the shadow of the prior. The oldest documents referencing this figure date back to the 13th century, when Durham was not only a spiritual center, but also a bastion of power and knowledge. Benedictine monks roamed its halls day and night. Scribes focused their gaze on manuscripts, and Gregorian chants rose like liquid prayers merging with the stone. In that context appears the figure of Prior Godric, a man of enviable wisdom and indomitable character who led the monastic community for more than 30 years. According to records, he was strict, meticulous, and deeply obsessed with the spiritual balance of his abbey. Under his guidance, Durham flourished, but it also became an unforgiving place for those who broke the rules, even minimally. There are accounts of secret penances, of monks sent to perpetual silence in dark chambers beneath the choir, of forbidden books buried in the crypts so no one could read lines that deviated from doctrine. It is said that Prior Godric believed the cathedral was not only a house of God, but an instrument of divine surveillance. Every column, every fresco, every capital contained a symbol whose correct interpretation guaranteed salvation. But that very conviction became his doom. One winter night in 1248, the prior did not appear for the Compline prayers. His chambers were locked from the inside, and the candle on his desk was still burning. When they finally forced the door open, they found the desk covered with diagrams and astronomical charts, Kabbalistic symbols mixed with passages from the Psalms, and in the center, a Latin manuscript with a single phrase repeated on every page. Lux in tenebris non comprehenderunt. The light in the darkness was not understood. But Godric's body was not there. They never found it. And since that night, something changed. The first to speak of the shadow were the novices. They said they saw it cross the cloister silently, always at sunset. Others claimed it appeared just after the last bell tolled, in the deepest corner of the cathedral where natural light never reached. The testimonies agreed on its description. It was not a human figure, but a precise absence, outlined against the stone, as if someone stood between the world and reality. But the most puzzling thing was that the shadow did not imitate anyone present. It was autonomous. Sometimes it slid along the wall. Other times it seemed to watch from above, motionless, but with palpable intent. For centuries, Durham's religious community coexisted with this phenomenon without naming it. Those who witnessed it remained silent. Some interpreted it as Godric's eternal punishment, others as a manifestation of the spirit of vigilance he established. Purification masses, exorcisms, blessings were attempted. Nothing changed. In fact, with every attempt to eradicate it, the shadow seemed to grow denser, more persistent, as if it fed on fear or attention. One of the most documented cases occurred in the 19th century, when a restorer hired by the diocese spent several nights in the underground archive, reorganizing ancient manuscripts. According to his notes, found years later among his belongings, the shadow appeared for the first time at 3 a.m, motionless, projected against a wall with no light source behind it. For 3 consecutive nights, he saw it repeat the same movement, sliding to a corner and stopping next to an empty niche, as if waiting for something or someone to come out. The man abandoned the project without explanation and refused to enter the cathedral again for the rest of his life. In recent decades, with advances in technology, thermal recordings and infrared cameras were used in the area known as the Corridor of the Dead, a hallway connecting the sacristy to the crypts. On at least 3 occasions, the recordings were interrupted by sudden failures and inexplicable energy spikes. In one, just before the image distorted, a black silhouette can be seen, for less than a second, where no one was present. The technicians refused to continue. But there is something deeper in this mystery. Because what disturbs is not the shadow's physical manifestation, but what it seems to represent. Some claim it is not the prior manifesting, but the residue of his vigilance, the echo of his obsession with spiritual control. As if his faith, in his final moment, became something beyond human, something that death could not dissolve, a kind of consciousness anchored to the place he ruled, and it still watches over it. The boldest theologians have suggested the shadow is not an individual entity, but a symbolic phenomenon, a living, or rather persistent, reminder of the weight religion can exert on the soul when distorted by extreme dogma. That shadow is the price of turning faith into control, prayer into punishment, divine pursuit into eternal surveillance. Today, Durham Cathedral remains active, open to the public, revered for its architecture and history. But there are areas not on visitor maps, doors that remain closed without explanation. Closing times moved earlier without apparent reason. And some guides, if asked with the right look, admit there is a corridor they avoid walking alone, especially when the sun begins to set. Because the shadow still appears. Not everyone sees it, but those who do never forget it. Sometimes it is at the back of the nave, behind a pillar. Sometimes on the empty pulpit, like the echo of a sermon that never ended. Sometimes in the reflection of a window, when the day dies and the stone begins to speak. And if one stays long enough, in complete silence, sometimes one can feel it. That eyeless gaze, that bodiless presence, that voiceless judgment. Because there are shadows that do not follow, that do not imitate, There are shadows that wait. And when they do so for one reason only. Someone must take their place. If this journey through the darkest corners of history captivated you, I invite you to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Here we keep exploring the secrets silenced for centuries. Your support keeps the search alive and allows these stories to keep coming to light. Because mysteries never sleep. And now, you are part of them. Good night.